Brown People Problems is now on Patreon. If you're not aware, Patreon is a platform that helps listeners like you contribute a small amount on a monthly basis to help creators like me continuing to create. Patreon will be a behind-the-scenes platform where you will have access to more of my raw thoughts, episode planning ideas, and even get to vote on your suggestions for the podcast. Did I also mention that I will have a chat on there and we can connect? With a minimum pledge of $2 per month, you will have access to all content on Patreon. So if you enjoy this content, if you enjoy the episodes, please consider visiting our Patreon page. It's going to be in the show notes. And consider making a pledge that is equivalent to a cup of coffee or a latte every month. Thank you so much. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems. Today we are talking about colonization of South Asia by Western countries. So in case you're thinking, okay, this came out of nowhere, let me explain. So I've always been interested in history, and so creating this episode has actually been a small labor of love, but it's just been a lot of fun for me. We always talk about the impacts of colonization of South Asian countries on this podcast. So I thought, hey, let's get into the history of it a little bit, unpack who all South Asian countries have been colonized by over the course of history, recorded history that we know, and how long the South Asian subcontinent has really been fought over. I hope you like history because today is going to be a fun history lesson in some parts of history that we may not know about, or even if we do, maybe not too much in detail. And I think there's going to be a couple things in this podcast episode that are going to be surprising to some of you. Now, I will have all of my research links linked down below. Feel free to do your own research if some of this doesn't, feel very accurate to your understanding. I do my best to collect research from reputable sources that are unbiased as much as possible and neutral, and a lot of them include scholarly articles down below. So who were the first European group to colonize South Asia? Now, like I said, let's go back to a lot of the recorded history. This is where I'm going to be starting this podcast. Chances are there had been other colonizing forces before this. Certainly, if not from Europe, then perhaps from Central Asia. But let's start with talking about Europe, because Europeans have colonized almost all of the world for a very, very long time. And so it's only fair that we look into that a little bit. All right, so something interesting happened in 1453. In the year 1453, Constantinople, which we now know today as Istanbul in Turkey, basically fell. That was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which is also the Roman Empire, and it was conquered by the Ottomans. Why is this important? So this is important because this was one of the principal land routes for spice trade at that time for Europe. So when Europe lost Constantinople and the Ottomans took over, Europeans lost their access to spices. And this was one really big reason amongst many at that time for European merchants to find their own access to the spice trade routes. And so a maritime route to Asia had to be found. This is how the story starts. Okay, so let's talk about two main explorers. We have Christopher Columbus, who was Italian, by the way. Did you know? Because I didn't for a very long time. Christopher Columbus was Italian and was commissioned not by the English king and queen. I don't know why so many of us think that. He was Italian and he was commissioned by the Spanish king and queen to set off to find the Indies. The Indies was basically like a group term that was used to describe a lot of South Asian countries because rumor had it that's where a lot of the spice was. The second guy we have is Vasco da Gama, who was Portuguese, and he was sent from the Portuguese monarchy and government to find a maritime route from Europe to Asia. So Columbus, we know Christopher Columbus's story. He went off west and he found a new continent, not India, but he found Bahamas. And that's where he landed, actually. He landed in Bahamas. and then he worked his way up. Vasco da Gama did something interesting. He went south. He went around the coast of Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southernmost tip of South Africa, went up the coast of East Africa, and landed in India. Before Vasco da Gama, though, there was another Portuguese guy named Bartholomew Dias. He sailed down the coast of West Africa and made his first voyage around the Cape of Good Hope. It just doesn't seem like he went all the way to India, but Vasco da Gama did. And he landed in Calicut, which is now known as Kozhikode in Kerala, which is the coast of southern India. So the Europeans reached South Asia, but things did not go as they expected. They encountered an issue they did not expect. They didn't have anything worthy that the brown folks wanted in return for trading their spices. What the Europeans did have, though, was quality weaponry. And so, surprise, surprise, they decided to take things by force. Namely, the trade network by force, and they established a monopoly on the spice trade. So it turns out more and more warships were sent around the Cape of Good Hope. Forts were built everywhere, starting with Cochin, which is now Kochi in India, in 1503. And then eventually this spread to Japan. As you can imagine, a lot of corruption may have happened, goods may have been confiscated, traders may have been pressured into favorable deals. King Manuel I of Portugal, who was the ruling king at that time, he basically declared a royal monopoly on the spice trade because the Portuguese got there first. And then not only that, in the year 1505, they went on to appoint a viceroy of India, even though the Portuguese had no real territorial claims beyond controlling coastal trading centers. So around 1497, 1499, like just before 1500, the year 1500, Vasco da Gama sails and he finds India, he lands in South India, and by the year 1505, the Portuguese government basically places a viceroy of India. Portuguese Goa, which is a place that we all know and love, was actually established by 1510. And within 20 years, it became the capital of Portuguese India. Interesting fact, they were still very much present in India, in Goa, until the early 1960s. Within another couple years, you have Malacca in Malaysia was also taken over, became a trading spot. You have Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, which followed in 1515. And then a fort was also established in Colombo, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, by 1518. So the Portuguese were actually among the earliest European powers to establish a presence in South Asia. So you have, in the 16th century, they've got trading ports everywhere. They've got forts, trading ports along the western coast of India, includes Goa, Daman, Diu. And basically their primary objectives were to monopolize the spice trade and of course to spread Christianity. However, their influence didn't last forever. It did wane over time as other European powers basically just expanded their presence in the region because word got around that South Asia had spices to share. A side note, when I was in Lisbon a couple of years ago in Portugal, I attended a walking tour of the city with somebody who was studying history or was a historian. I don't particularly remember, but they were a dedicated student to history, and they said that basically in the year 1755 in Lisbon, there was a huge tsunami, an earthquake, and a fire. Basically, it felt like the apocalypse. Over 60,000 people died in Lisbon alone, not to mention the surrounding areas. And some of the earthquake was actually felt almost all the way up to Sintra. A lot of people believe that this caused the Portuguese government to pivot their resources and attentions to rebuilding their own city. Because this tsunami, this fire, this earthquake, it lasted days and weeks. And this shift in attention, some people believe, made it easier for other powers to come in and push them aside. So while the Portuguese are there, basically the seas were no longer safe. Okay, you had even ships that had trading goods other than spices, they had to travel basically with a Portuguese issued passport. And if they didn't, the cargo and the ship were confiscated, the crew was imprisoned, or even worse. And in addition to having a a passport, the ships also had to pay custom duties at their port of call. Apparently, some records show that custom duties accounted for almost 60% of the entire Portuguese revenue in the East at that time. There were some side repercussions of this as well. Missionaries spread Christian faith. Plants and animals were introduced to new places. That's caused unforeseen repercussions in habitat, upset the balance of local ecological systems, the balance of the natural flora and fauna of the places. Disease, of course, spread in all directions to find new victims. And so basically, the demand for spices grew and word got around that the Portuguese had the monopoly on this. So now this is where the Dutch folks come in. You thought I was going to say the British, didn't you? No, but before the British get here, we have the Dutch. They also wanted a piece of the pie, and they basically started attacking Portuguese forts and centers for trading. The Dutch were able to gain control of some ports in the 17th century. So in the year 1641, they took control of Malacca in Malaysia. By 1656, they took control of Colombo in Sri Lanka. And by 1663, they took control of Kochi in Kerala, India. So colonization, right, is now just no longer commercial. It became political. It became about holding territory. It became about conquering indigenous people. It became about civilizing, quote unquote, heathens. And it became about resettling Europeans. Trading companies were set up by Dutch, and by this time, English also came in, which basically allowed for more efficient acquisition and distribution of goods. So now it's not just spices that's being traded out of South Asia. You have got sugarcane, cotton, tea, opium, gold, diamonds, and human slaves. We all know about the East India Company. There was also the British East India Company. There was also a Dutch East India Company that was active in the 17th and 18th centuries. Like I said just earlier, they had some trading posts, but their influence was quite limited. The French also made an appearance. So French colonial interests in South Asia were primarily focused on establishing trading posts and territories in the Indian subcontinent. So French colonies had a significant presence in places like Pondicherry, which is now Puducherry in India, in Chandranagore, which is Chandanagar. So the British initially, like everyone else, came for trade around the year 1600, but like everybody else, stayed for more. It's interesting when I was reading up about this, and this is something that was new information for me, but the dominance of British colonization seems to coincide with the Mughal Empire decline in India. So historians say that Aurangzeb, who is, a notoriously popular Mughal emperor, when he died in 1707, it caused a lot of political instability, which the British took advantage of. There is a Battle of Plassey in Bengal that happened at that time that is really widely referenced. This is a huge battle that was fought around that time. It was fought between the British East India Company and the Nawab of Bengal at that time and his French allies. He was being backed by the French. He was apparently a really young guy, 23 or 24. Long story short, a lot of corruption happened, a lot of backstabbing happened. The British won, and they effectively established control over Bengal, which had, one of the biggest trading ports. The Battle of Plassey took place in 1757. A few years later, let's go to 1784, there was a really important act passed. It was called Pitt's India Act, which basically resulted in dual control of India by the Crown of England and also by East India Company. So essentially, the British got full direct control over Indian administration, civil administration, military administration. This allowed them social control and this direct commercial control. Queen Victoria essentially allowed the independent princely states to function. Before, it was one independent country. Well, South Asia had hundreds of independent princely states. So Queen Victoria said, you are allowed to conduct independent function only if you swear allegiance to the crown. So you can see that there was a clear hierarchy and power differential was established. So the East India Company is still very much here in the picture, but now they're sharing control with British Crown. The British Raj, when we talk about the crown taking over, the British Raj technically started only in 1858 until independence in 1947. So that's a long time, right? British East India Company came in the year 1600, stayed till 1947, folks. 1600 to 1947. So before we get into the British Raj and how that actually started, there's another European power that we need to talk about, and that's Denmark. I did not know that Denmark made an appearance too, but they did. Denmark was not as prominent as the other colonial powers in South Asia, but they did have colonies and trading posts. Tranquebar, which is now Therangambadi in Tamil Nadu, was a Danish colony from the early 17th century until it was sold to the British in 19th century. And Google this place. It's like the architecture is beautiful, but it was effectively just abandoned because it wasn't turning over as much profit to the Danes. They also had Serampore in Bengal, which is now part of West Bengal in India. That was also under Danish possession. Everybody did spices, but one of the main trades encouraged by the Danes was the production of textiles. So they had local Indian dyers and weavers who created beautiful silks, plain and painted cloth, scarves, shawls, and a large amount of these textiles were hand painted. And they were some of the most important merchandise to be traded along with pepper and other spices that were in constant demand. And when I Googled this place, Tranquebar, now known as Therangambadi, it looks so nice. Like you can see that a lot of the history is still preserved, but effectively it was abandoned from what I understand. So they also made an appearance. So you can see there's a lot of hands in this pot. A lot of people want a piece of this pie. So let's talk about how the British Raj actually started. It started in 1858 and stayed until independence in 1947. Something interesting happened in 1857, and this is what I do remember from history class. There was basically a big mutiny, an Indian soldier mutiny, also called a Sepoy mutiny, in 1857, when an Indian soldier named Mangal Pandey started a riot. So historians say, and there is mixed data around this. Some folks are very clear on this. Some folks say this was more of a rumor, but research shows that essentially the Indian soldiers got a new rifle and they had to bite off ends of the cartridge to load the weapon. The problem was that cartridge that they had to bite off was coated with cow and pig fat. As you can see, that would be really offensive to a lot of people in South Asia. And so he stood up and he said, this is not okay. He tried to rally others to stand with him. And so as a consequence, he was unfortunately arrested and hung. Actually, it is said that the East India Company actually just expedited his hanging too because they didn't want another riot to happen. But that's exactly what happened. Riots started breaking up everywhere over, the injustice of it, but also over the cartridges. This, amongst many other things, basically caused the Crown to step in, and they dissolved British East India Company, and now they imposed direct rule. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. So hopefully that's a nice series of events, right? We started with the Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, and if you've ever been to Goa, you will see Vasco da Gama's presence there. I was in Goa a couple times. I have also been to Pondicherry, which was the French colonial part of what is now India. And these buildings, the architecture, the culture, the food, a lot of it is still there. But it started off with Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese. The Dutch came in, the French came in, the British came in, and the Danes also came in, but the British stayed the longest. So what's the big deal about colonization? Why are we talking about this? I mean, the obvious stuff besides, many people, have claimed that British colonialism brought prosperity and development to South Asian countries. There was a poll done in Britain where they basically found that 32% of people in Britain are actually proud of their nation's colonial history. There's also an economic historian, Robert Allen. He basically says, though, that, yeah, okay, maybe there's some prosperity and development, but the cost was huge. According to economic historians, extreme poverty in India increased under British rule from 23% in 1810, from 23% in the year 1810 to more than 50% in the mid-20th century. That is mid-1900s. Apparently, real wages declined during the British colonial period. Famines became more frequent and more deadly. One of the bigger, most famous famines I've heard of is the famine of Bengal as well in the 1900s. Experts say that the period of year 1880 to the year 1920 was the height of Britain's imperial power in India, and that was also the most particularly devastating period for India. There's been a lot of population consensus during the colonial regime, beginning in the 1880s, that show us that the death rate increased considerably during this period, from 37.2 deaths per 1,000 people in the 1880s to 44.2% in the 1910s. So I'm going to repeat that. Death rate increased considerably during 40 years, from 37.2 deaths per 1,000 people in the 1880s to 44.2% in the 1910s. Life expectancy also declined from 26.7 years to 21.9 years. Historians say that if you see this as the baseline for normal mortality, then some 50 million excess deaths occurred under the British colonialism period during 1891 to 1920. It's estimated that around 50 million excess deaths occurred during this time. 50 million is a staggering figure, and some historians say that that's a very conservative estimate. A lot of historians show that living standards in colonial India had already declined dramatically from their previous levels, and actually, historians argue that before colonialism, Indian living standards may have been on par with developing parts of Western Europe. We don't really know for sure, but they declined rapidly after. Other reports say that 165 million excess deaths occurred in India during that period. So I don't know about you, but 165 million is a number beyond my comprehension. So how does this economic disparity happen? I was really surprised by these numbers, so I decided to look into this a little bit. And my research may still be incomplete, but what I found that basically in 1757, remember when the Battle of Plassey happened and the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies were defeated by the British East India Company. The colonial regime practically just eliminated custom duties and Indian tariffs. What happened from there, the British goods basically just flood the entire domestic market, and it created exorbitant taxes and internal duties that basically prevented Indians from selling cloth within their own country, let alone exporting it. There was this unequal trade that was happening, which crushed Indian manufacturers and deindustrialized the country. There's a quote from the chairman of the time of East India and China Association, where he's heard boasting in Parliament in 1840, and he says, "This company has succeeded in converting India from a manufacturing country into a country exporting raw produce." So poverty went on the rise, and people were more and more vulnerable to hunger and disease. Several famines, like I said, have been recorded where millions and millions of people died. Some people argue this and say that colonialism did not cause famines and whatnot. But I will encourage you to turn to your own ancestral and cultural stories, and I will encourage you to conduct your own academic research to get some clarity for yourself on this. One economic historian also talks about how there was a drain of wealth that was happening. Basically, what happened, the East India Company, they taxed the Indian population, basically, and then used the revenues to buy Indian products like indigo, grain, cotton, opium, thus obtaining these goods for free. So these goods were then either consumed within Britain or then re-exported abroad, and the revenues were pocketed by the company and was used to finance the industrial development of settler colonies like US, Canada, and Australia. Some economic historians estimate that this system drained South Asia of goods worth trillions of dollars in today's money. Not to mention the forced migration of indentured laborers from India to British tropical colonies that happened, like colonies of Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and British Guyana. And not to mention, on top of it all, the massive scale traumas that had happened around the years of independence, namely in 1947, and how that's basically left all South Asian countries fighting with one another while still holding the West as the benchmark for success in so many ways. So that, in a nutshell, that in a really big nutshell is a glimpse into the colonial history of South Asia, and in particular, Western colonization of South Asia. Hundreds of years is a long time, folks. So next time, we think about, well, what's the big deal with colonization? Why are we talking about it all the time these days? What is the big hoopla with colonization? Hopefully this gives a little bit more context, that it's a very long, painful, gruesome history that has created a huge economic impact on the South Asian subcontinent, not to mention a cultural, political one. All right, folks, thank you for listening to me. I am getting to live my history teacher dreams with this episode. Let me know, what are your thoughts on this? And like I said, my links will be linked down below. If you have any thoughts, any comments, let me know. It's nice to talk about our history. I learned a lot actually through my research about history of Western colonization of South Asia. I had no idea that the Danes and the Dutch were there as well. So it's really nice to learn more about the history and the past of places that we come from and our ancestral stories. Thanks for listening, everyone. Do your own research, stay informed, stay connected, and use your critical thinking. See you next time. The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.